Hey everyone, welcome to Science in Perspective, Episode 1. In 2019, Google made an announcement based on its quantum computer called Sycamore. It had solved a problem, it did it relatively quickly, and it said that this is something only a quantum computer could do. In fact, if you tried to do it using classical computers, these are the computers that you and I use every day, although a beefed up version of that. Let's say you took the best classical supercomputer you had, Google said that would probably take about 10,000 years, if it could be done at all. And so this was essentially a claim by Google in 2019 that quantum supremacy had been achieved. Quantum supremacy is the point at which a quantum computer is going to be able to solve something that a classical computer could not, or that a classical computer would take so much time to solve that it would just be impractical. So they made that announcement. But lo and behold, a few years later, a research group out of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, Pan Zhang and his colleagues, came up with an approach that used classical computers to actually do it faster and more energy efficient than Google's quantum computer. And they did it with classical computers. So we've got this kind of funny situation. 2019, Google, massive company, put all this money into a quantum computer. They're one of the leaders. They solve this problem with the quantum computer. They make this announcement, and then it, related to quantum supremacy, saying that classical computers are essentially never going to be able to do this. And only a few years later, a classical computer does it, and it does it better by the performance metrics. It does it faster, and it does it with less energy. So how could Google or anyone else interested in quantum computing actually get this wrong? How could it be that bad? How could you say something like this will never happen, or it's going to take 10,000 years, and in fact, it only took a few years? It shows a massive misalignment between what quantum computers can actually do and the hype surrounding it. Of course, we're all familiar with hype. AI gets a lot of hype. Nanotechnology has gotten a lot of hype over the years. Lots of things get hype, and quantum computing is no exception. But this is a really big delta between what we thought quantum computers were doing and what seemed to not be the case only a few years later. Now, this is not to say that quantum computing is not real. Of course it is. It is happening. There are real quantum calculations happening. And it's not to downplay the potential of quantum computers either. I mean, they do hold great promise. Although I think the challenges, as I'm going to argue in this episode, are severely downplayed. The hype is quite bad. And this is important because if you're an investor or you're a company that's looking to invest time and or money into quantum computers for your own business, you should have a realistic understanding of what quantum computing is, and more to the point, what quantum computers can actually do. Give you a more really realistic, foreseeable future of where these things might go. And I think that's way off. I think there's a lot of rose-colored lenses happening here. And we need to put quantum computing in perspective. So let's deal with quantum computing first. I want to make sure that you as a listener understand what quantum computing is. As I do in these episodes, as you'll see, I be very conceptual. I try to be very intuitive about it, but not skimp out on the details. Well, not skimp out on the depth, if you will, of the most profound points. So it's going deep, but keeping it conceptual. And hopefully you'll be able to understand, in this case, what quantum computing is, and then I'll relate that to some of the challenges from an engineering perspective of what it takes to make it realistic. Okay, so to understand quantum computing, let's first understand problem solving in general. A problem is obviously a situation that we want resolved. In order to resolve it, we have to take information about that problem and kind of mix and match that information until we get to kind of a new scenario or situation that we recognize as a solution. This is the case with any problem you want to solve. Simple problems, maybe little mazes that we have to work our way through. It could be a math problem. It could be negotiating a peace treaty with North Korea. Whatever it is a problem that has information. We take in that information, we mix and match that information until we resolve it as a situation that we recognize as a solution. So it's the mixing and matching of all the variables that are involved that is required for problem solving. And that's, of course, what computing is. Regardless of whether we get into classical or quantum, if you are organizing photos on your computer, if you're having a Zoom call, even if you're generating an AI image, what you're doing is you're essentially solving some type of problem. And the way that problem gets solved by a computing machine is by mixing and matching information until the configuration of information that we need appears. That's what problem solving is. Okay, we do that as humans as well. Our brains are presumably doing that. That is definitely what a computer does. So let's start with classical computers to understand how transistors essentially do that. And then we'll move on to these things called qubits, which are kind of the quantum mechanical counterpart to the bit or the transistor physically that we see in classical computers. Okay, so a classical computer is going to solve a problem like any type of machine would, which is by mixing and matching information together until it gets the right mix and match, right? Until it gets the right configuration. Of course, the way a classical computer does this, the computers that you and I use on smartphones, on laptops, on desktops, and whatever, is by flipping and flopping these little electrical switches back and forth called transistors. Right? These are binary operations. It could be a yes or a no, a 1 or a 0. If you get billions or even trillions of these little switches going back and forth, then you can represent problems in this binary fashion. So it could be an image, it could be a folder. We can represent something as, this 100,000 switches are facing this way, these 100,000 are facing this, whatever. Let's say we do it to 1 trillion transistors. Basically, you can always represent some situation as some combination of yeses and nos, okay? That's true. Now, if you need to mix and match those yeses and nos, which is what you're doing to try to solve a problem. So we had an image, now we have to change the image to something else. Or we have this photo, we have to drag it into a folder. We have a maze and we have to work out, we're playing chess, we're playing checkers, we got to move pieces, whatever it is. Now we have to mix and match all the different possible configurations, or at least a lot of them. Well, physically, what's happening in a classical computer is you're now flipping and flopping all those transistors in many different ways. So if you flip these 1,000 transistors this way and you keep all the rest the same, that's now a new configuration. If you flip these 1,000,000 this way and you keep that 1,000 the same and the other ones are there, that's a new configuration. And there could be millions or billions or trillions and even far more possible combinations or configurations that you could try. And so the harder the problem, the more of these different configurations of transistors physically and of, binary ones and zeros informationally you have to try. That's what problem solving comes down to, and that's how you're computing it. Now, this is why really hard problems are quite intractable or unsolvable even for our fastest supercomputers, right? Even if you take something like a Rubik's Cube, think about how many different configurations you have to try to actually solve it. Now, I'm not talking about, going online and looking up an existing set of steps to solve it. These things have already been solved that way. If you had to do it for the first time, a Rubik's Cube has 43 plus quintillion possible configurations. And this is just a Rubik's Cube that you hold in your hand with 3 different axes. That's nothing close to, a real world problem like negotiating a peace treaty with North Korea or something like that. The point is that even a Rubik's Cube that you hold in your hand has an astronomical number of possible configurations that you would have to try, again, if you didn't have any other information to try to resolve the problem. If it was just kind of a raw brute force trial and error, you'd have to try maybe a few quintillion until you stumbled upon something that was a solution, right? Now, of course, we do this a lot faster than that. That's getting into things that are beyond the scope. The human brain can use heuristics. It can use these pattern recognition approaches that can guide us towards, the answer within that vast space of possibilities. But the point is even systems that aren't that big have a lot of possible combinations or configurations that could be tried. And you've got to search through that space of possibilities before you land on an answer. So that's problem solving. And classical computing does that by flipping and flopping these little electrical switches called transistors, right? That's these binary operations that have to happen because you can represent information of a problem in that binary fashion, and you can create so many different possible binary configurations, you could eventually move through that space of possibilities until you get the answer. Now, because so many problems are very difficult, categorically hard, and just downright intractable, because again, if you wanted to, let's say, solve or rather try 43 plus quintillion configurations, if you actually had to do them all, that would take multiple lifetimes of the universe. I mean, literally, these are astronomically hard. The fastest supercomputers in the world just can't do that. Okay, they got to rely on other methods. They get approximate. They use pattern recognition. They use different things. But to actually try all those configurations would take more time than there is available in the entire universe. Okay, that's literally how difficult those problems are. And the harder the problem, the more configurations you have to try. So quantum computing comes in and says, look, there's a different way we could do this. What if there was a way to try all possible configurations at once? Do the whole thing in parallel. See, there's this sequential nature to classical computing where it tries one configuration, then it tries the next, then it tries the next, then it tries the next. Now, if you're talking about 43 quintillion configurations, you can imagine that's basically just intractable. But even for a lot of problems that this can get very difficult, maybe even a Zoom call, maybe even, dragging enough folders or files into a folder, right? If the problem becomes hard enough and there's too many different configurations to try, to mix and match to get the solution, it's going to take too long for a classical computer to compute. And there are a lot of important problems like this. Think about things like drug discovery, where you have to conform the protein molecule computationally into many different conformations, where there can be billions and billions or trillions, actually far more possible configurations that protein molecule could be situated in. And a classical computer is going to find it very difficult to try even a reasonable number of those configurations. Okay, so it becomes quite intractable. But now imagine quantum computing comes in and says, what if we could try all the possible configurations at once? Now, obviously, that sounds amazing. That would be a huge, massive, game-changing improvement in computing because, again, that's what problem solving comes down to. That is the very nature of problem solving itself. Regardless of the problem you're talking about, you can grab information from that problem, and what problem solving is to computationally mix and match the information until you get the right configuration that represents the solution. That's always the case. So now you have quantum computers coming in and with the prospect of trying all possible configurations at once and then just resolving that system into a solution. Of course, that sounds amazing. So why isn't it here yet? And why isn't that happening? Well, first of all, let's understand how quantum computers purport to do this, or the people building quantum computers purport to be able to create a system that tries all possible configurations at once. Well, we have to understand that quantum computers are using qubits, and qubits are kind of, essentially the analog to the bit. So when I was talking about transistors in classical computers, right, they could be 1, they can be 0. The qubit can be 1 and 0 at the same time. Because one of the quantum phenomena that occurs in very small particles, where you tend to see quantum phenomena occurring, is this thing called superposition, this phenomenon called superposition. And superposition means essentially you can be a 1 and a 0 at the same time. Things are in a superpositional state when they are neither this or that. They seem to be something kind of fuzzy and in the middle. And this is what we see quantum mechanically at the very small scale. So when it comes to things like bits, you could think of it as being not totally yes and not totally no, but kind of fuzzy and in the middle. Now, why would that help in a computing problem? Why would that help you try many different configurations? Well, if you're just talking about one qubit that's kind of in between 1 and 0, it wouldn't really help that much. But the fuzziness, the in-betweenness, actually scales exponentially. So if you have 2 qubits, if you have 3 qubits, it tends to scale as 2 to the n, where n is, essentially the size of the input or the size of the problem. In other words, let's say you had 40 qubits. Well, this could end up being trillions of possible configurations held within a quantum system at once. Okay, that's because all 40 qubits would essentially be in a superposition. And it's a superposition of all possible states of the problem that we're trying to solve. So again, remember that problem solving, you can always take the situation, here's the problem, you convert that into, or you take information from that problem, and then you encode that information into a machine, and then you get that information, the machine, to mix and match that information until it gets the right configuration. Well, it's the same thing. You're going to look at a problem with quantum computing. You're going to take the information and the constraints and the knowledge that you have about that problem. You're going to encode that as information into the machine. But now, instead of it being a bunch of physical transistors, you have these qubits that can take that represented information and represent it as all possible configurations as once. Because qubits are quantum mechanical, they exhibit quantum phenomena, and the quantum phenomenon that we're talking about here is superposition. So all the possible configurations you could have, it is believed that a quantum system of, let's say, 40 qubits would have all those possible combinations baked into the system itself. That's what the quantum system is. That is what it is believed to be. Okay. So the quantum computer, we haven't solved anything, but it's basically saying that we can create these qubits, and this might be something like a trapped ion or a superconducting piece of metal. It doesn't really matter. The point is it's something that's very small and typically very cold and very isolated, and they can create these quantum mechanical systems that can be somewhat controlled. You can create a quantum system that captures the information about the problem using superposition so that all possible configurations are actually held informationally within the system at once. So if you can resolve that system towards its answer, then the argument is you would get the answer to something analogous to trying all the possible configurations and finding the configuration that is correct. So it's kind of like, imagine you could encode the information from the Rubik's Cube problem in a quantum system. Well, the quantum system would have all the possible configurations the Rubik's Cube could be in. And if you resolved that quantum system, which I'll talk about in a second, how they do that, that answer would presumably represent the answer to the Rubik's Cube. Okay, if you could take the maze and encode that information about the maze into a quantum system, the quantum system would physically represent all the possible paths you could follow through the maze. If you could grab all the information from a peace treaty negotiation with North Korea, you would encode that, and all the possible things you could try during that negotiation would be encoded in the quantum system. So now you just have to resolve that quantum system to get the answer. And how does that work? Well, this happens because so if you think of maybe back to high school, like chemistry or physics, and you're thinking about the structure of an atom, we know that electrons sit at certain levels. And one of the arguments for this, or of kind of how this might come to be, is that, electrons act as waves, right? It's sometimes called a wave. We call it a wave function. And because it acts as a wave, it will constructively interfere and destructively interfere. So if you imagine you have two waves in a lake, one person splashes on the left, the other person splashes on the right. The two waves meet each other. If the crests are both meeting at the top, then they will constructively interfere into a wave that's like essentially twice the size, right? Whereas if they destructively interfere, then the crest meets the trough, they cancel each other out. And so the argument for electrons existing at certain energy levels, quanta, which is where the name comes from, is that you get constructive interference at certain levels and destructive interference where they cancel each other out at other levels. And that's why you don't have a smooth transition of electron levels. You have these discrete quanta or energy levels. So what you can do with a quantum system in quantum computing is you can find where the quantum state is constructively interfering. Just like those waves coming together, where do the waves come together to reinforce each other versus where do they come together to cancel each other out? And the argument is that where they constructively interfere with each other, that's supposed to be the solution to the problem. Okay? So we're talking about quantum computers. We're talking about qubits, which are quantum mechanical things, right? Entities, whether these are like trapped ions or little pieces of superconducting metal, doesn't matter. It's small. It exhibits quantum phenomena, and therefore it is capable of superposition. So if you take these, let's say, trapped ions, and you get 40 of them, and they are in a superposition state, it's supposed to represent every possible configuration of the problem, assuming you encoded the problem correctly. And if you could find out where they constructively interfere, it would represent the solution, which would be the configuration that is the answer to the problem. Now, they use things like quantum gates to, work with the quantum algorithms to essentially allow these qubits to, interfere with each other and to kind of recognize where they're constructively interfering and where they're not. And this can kind of be guided and all this kind of stuff. But that's essentially the point of a quantum computer. Now, another quantum mechanical phenomenon that, we talked about superposition. I talked about superposition. There's also entanglement. Entanglement is something that means that no matter how far apart two quantum mechanical particles are, they act as though they're talking to each other. So essentially, you could have them light years apart. You don't know anything about them, but then you go to measure one, and that immediately determines the state of the other particle that went the other direction. Not because they are connected in any way, not because the information was encoded before they left each other, but because when you go to actually measure the one, now the measurement or the information contained in the other one is now available. So again, this is very counterintuitive. It might not seem to make sense, but welcome to quantum mechanics, right? That's called entanglement. Now there's all kinds of, Bell's theorem and superdeterminism and, this notion of, how are we supposed to interpret that? We won't get into that. Pretty much the most common interpretation is that, when these particles are far apart, they're kind of sharing the same wave function, which has not collapsed yet. But as soon as you go to measure one, you collapse the wave function, and now those two particles take on the property that they're supposed to have. But it doesn't happen until you measure it. So anyways, basically there's a super long range kind of dependency between these particles. They share their existence in some kind of mysterious way. That's called entanglement. That also plays a role in quantum computers because not only do you want to know all or presumably try all the different configurations of a problem, those configurations can be related to each other, right? The different variables can kind of talk to each other. There's these kind of linear and nonlinear dependencies between them. If I go to make a move on a Rubik's Cube, that could mess up the move that I made before that, right? There's this kind of interactions between the configurations. the entanglement kind of takes that into account as you are exploring all these different configurations, so the argument goes. Okay, so that's quantum computing. Problem solving is always about mixing and matching. The classical computer has to mix and match using these little flippy-flop transistors, ones and zeros. It essentially has to try different configurations sequentially in order. That takes a long time. It makes a lot of naturally hard problems very intractable. Even though you can kind of parallelize things with graphics processing units and maybe a computing cluster or center that uses a bunch of different CPUs in parallel, that's nothing like the parallelization you would get from quantum computing, which is able to create a quantum system that holds all possible configurations at once. And if you can resolve it, it would constructively interfere to the answer, which would be, essentially analogous or equivalent to, let's say trying the 43 plus quintillion different configurations and actually knowing the one that represents the answer. Okay, or one of the ones that represents the answer. So that's the idea of quantum computing. And quantum mechanics is, of course, real, and quantum computers are real, and there are real things called qubits, and they really can be in a superposition, and they really do have entanglement. And so they have all these properties that should allow a problem to be represented in such a fashion and resolved in such a fashion that the speed up would be just mind-blowing relative to the way a classical computer would do things using transistors the way they normally do and doing things sequentially in that binary fashion. Okay, so why doesn't it work super well? I mean, it's not that it doesn't work, but why aren't we just solving problems all the time with quantum computers? Why aren't they drastically surpassing, what you see with classical computers? Well, in some very, very kind of narrowly defined problems, they do seem to be working a bit better. Okay, but the engineering challenges to actually get quantum computers to work are massive. Okay, and this is where you can get a little too reductionist, a little too idealistic about the theory of physics, and not taking into account just how complex the engineering is going to be to scale up something like a quantum computer. You have to avoid things like decoherence. Basically, you need to isolate the quantum system from the rest of the world, right? From the environment. If you're talking about trapped ions or superconducting pieces of metal, you need to really isolate them, keep them in extremely low sub-zero temperatures, and any kind of communication from the external world to that internal isolation tends to mess up the quantum system. So it's like you're trying to run a computing system in the realm of where quantum mechanics happens, which is in the realm of the very cold and the very small, and not have it, kind of communicate with the external world. And yet there has to be some communication because we got to get the answer. Those quantum gates have to allow the constructive interference. We have to pull the answer back from there. So that's a huge challenge, right? And so, and you, in some sense, you have to integrate, the quantum systems with classical computers because, again, we got to get the answer out and kind of use it as we normally would in computing. There's all kinds of errors that can propagate, from essentially contaminating your isolated system. It's a very, very tricky, hard to do thing. You can only get so many qubits. You might get 30 or 40 in a system, let's say. And that would still probably be nowhere near enough to do something like a Rubik's Cube if you wanted to try all the possible configurations, right? Because that would be 43 quintillion. And a Rubik's Cube is still far simpler than a lot of real world problems or things like, say, like protein discovery for drug discovery and stuff like that. So you got to put that in perspective. The quantum computers today are just barely solving kind of interesting problems, but barely interesting problems. That doesn't mean they won't in the future. But the engineering challenges, in many ways, have been dramatically underestimated, or at least kind of sold that way. It's very hard to isolate the systems. It's very hard to get a system with a lot of different qubits, which you would still need. It's very hard to communicate the answer from that quantum mechanical system back to the so-called, kind of real world or macro real world, where we can actually use the answer. And that leads to a lot of hype, because when you want to get funding and you want people to get excited about research, and of course you do, you don't want to go into all those details about just how hard it is to get these, even the most basic, if you will, quantum computer to work. You want to say, well, theoretically, like what I just said previously, look at all this parallelization, look at this, the theoretical speed up that you should get because you can capture all possible configurations at once. The benchmarks that are used are typically quite theoretical benchmarks as opposed to real world benchmarks. Not to say that there's none there, for speed and efficiency, but they're pretty theoretical. It's rooted in a lot of theory. There's a big difference or delta between that theory and what it would take to make computing realistic and practical going forward. It doesn't mean it's not possible, but we're not even close at this time to really making quantum computers overly practical. Now, things can change fast. Things can all of a sudden, change overnight, a big dramatic improvement in some quantum algorithm or some way to isolate the system perhaps and avoid the error rates. But that's what that is. Okay? So just a really quick recap. I hope that all made sense. And I said at the beginning, 2019, Google has this quantum computer. You've all probably heard of quantum computers, but maybe you don't really know how they work. Anyways, they made this announcement in 2019. They solved this problem. And they said, look, it would take the best computers in the world, 10,000 plus years to do the same thing. A few years later, Pan Zhang and his team comes out and they do it. And they do it faster and they do it more efficiently just using classical computing. And so that completely smashed this so-called quantum supremacy claim that Google had. And it just kind of begs the question, how could such a grand statement be made only to be beaten a few years later? And then I said, okay, well, first let's understand what quantum computing is. Let's understand problem solving. It's always about the mixing and matching of information. Classical computers mix and match that information by using these transistors that flip and flop back and forth between 1 and 0. You do that with trillions of transistors, and that's your way of mixing and matching information, which is trying basically a bunch of different configurations until you get the configuration that works. That's what problem solving is. That's what computing is. And quantum computers do the same thing. We just take the information for the problem and we mix and match. But the mixing and matching is not really the mixing and matching where you're trying all the different configurations. Instead, you take advantage of quantum mechanics, which allows you to do things like superposition and entanglement, which essentially just means you can have all possible configurations existing at once in one system at one instant in time. And because of that, if you can find a way to basically collapse that whole system down to the answer, then presumably you could solve things extremely fast, even though they're really hard. Hard meaning you have to try a lot of configurations. The way that you collapse that whole system down in quantum computing is you have these quantum gates that basically look for where the waves, because in quantum mechanics we're talking wave functions, where those waves of the quantum system are constructively interfering versus destructively interfering. Constructively interfering means the peaks of the waves touch each other, they reinforce each other, it stabilizes the system. Anything else where the trough and the wave are matching up, or the peaks don't match up that well, they kind of cancel each other out. And so that breaks the system down to the one or very few configurations that presumably represent a solution to the problem. So that's a very powerful way to get at problem solving, but it's the same thing. It's still just mixing and matching information to get the configuration you want. It's just doing it all at the same time. Now, that sounds wonderful, but it's still highly, highly impractical for just about every problem under the sun, because the engineering challenges associated with actually getting enough qubits into the system, isolating those qubits from the external environment so that you can maintain the superposition and the entanglement, trying to avoid this thing called decoherence, where basically the real world starts to leak into the system. It gets a little too warm, it gets a little too agitated. You basically interfere with the superposition and the entanglement that you would have otherwise had if you had been able to avoid this decoherence. It's very theoretical. The benchmarks are very theoretical. And there's really not a whole lot you can do with quantum computers today. That might change. There's also some drastic assumptions about computation in general. Naturally hard problems may not be computed in this kind of always just mixing and matching different configurations fashion. Maybe there's something we're not understanding about the way nature actually computes. So there's a lot of assumptions there. Okay, so there's a ton of hype with quantum computers. Yes, the potential's there. Yes, it might lead to something. And hey, things can change fast. But understand what it is and how realistic it is and is not. Put that into perspective, and hopefully I've been able to do that for you too. Okay, so this episode was about quantum computing and how realistic it is, and hopefully that all made sense. Okay, so that's it for this episode. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, take care.